I was married for 51 years. I left when I was 79. Most people thought I lost my mind. I thought so too for a while. But here's what nobody tells you about a long, quiet, respectable marriage that looks fine from the outside. You can disappear inside one completely, and nobody will notice, including you. There was a blue shirt in my drawer I stopped wearing sometime in the 90s. I couldn't explain why for years. When I finally understood what that shirt meant, I realized I had the answer to a question I'd been too afraid to ask myself for 3 decades. I'm 84 years old, and the most brutal thing I know about staying in a sexless marriage too long isn't what it does to the marriage. It's what it does to the man. Tell me in the comments, how long have you been not saying the thing you need to say? I spent 47 years sleeping next to a woman who didn't want me. I want to be precise about that word, want, not love. Eleanor loved me. I believe that. She was loyal, consistent, present in every way a person can be present, except the one way that, over time, becomes the way that counts most. She was my wife. She was the mother of my children. She was, by every external measure, a good partner. And for 47 years, I told myself that was enough, that wanting more made me shallow, that a man my age, with my responsibilities, with my life, should be grateful for what he had. I was wrong, and it took me until I was 79 years old to say that out loud. But I'm not starting there. I'm starting in a hotel room in Cleveland, November 1987. I was 47 years old, exactly half the age I am now, which is a fact I find genuinely disorienting. And I was lying on a double bed in a business hotel near the airport, staring at the ceiling after a day of client meetings. And I had a thought so clear and so complete that it arrived almost without emotion, the way a diagnosis sometimes does. This is what the rest of my life is going to be. Not said with rage, not with grief, with the flat, exhausted certainty of a man who had just done the arithmetic on his own existence and arrived at a number he recognized. I was 47 years old. Eleanor and I had not been physically close in any real sense for several years by then, not since before our youngest was born. And what I understood in that hotel room, in the particular silence that comes from being alone in a city where nobody knows you, was that I had stopped believing it was temporary. Somewhere along the way, I couldn't have told you when, there was no single moment, I had reclassified the situation from problem we haven't addressed yet to the way things are. I ordered room service. I watched the news. I flew home the next morning and didn't say a word to anyone about what I'd figured out. Let me tell you who I was before that, because I don't want you to think I was always this man, the quiet one, the accommodating one, the one who accepted things. I wasn't. I grew up in a loud house in Pittsburgh. 3 brothers, a father who worked at the steel mill and laughed from his whole chest, a mother who had opinions about everything and stated them without apology. I was the kind of young man who took up space, not aggressively, but confidently, the way people do when they've been told, without anyone ever quite saying it, that they belong in the room. I had friends, plans, appetites. I liked people. I liked being near people, physically near them, the way some people do, a hand on a shoulder, a brief embrace that meant something, the warmth of another body in proximity that wasn't just tolerated, but genuinely wanted. I met Eleanor when I was 29. She was quiet in a way I found interesting then, contained, composed, like someone who kept good things in reserve. I mistook that reserve for depth. I don't say that to be cruel. It was depth in many ways. Eleanor was an intelligent, complicated woman. But the reserve was also just reserve. It was also simply the way she was built. Someone for whom physical closeness was not a need, but an occasional courtesy. I didn't know that about her in the beginning, and I'm not sure knowing it would have changed anything, which is itself a thing I've had to sit with. We married in 1969. The first years were fine. Not remarkable in that department. Not what I'd have written if I was scripting my own life, but fine, present, occasional, enough that I didn't feel the shape of the absence yet. And then our first child came, and the second, and the third, and life filled up the way life does. And I told myself, we both told ourselves, I think, without ever saying it, that things would settle back down once the children were older, once work calmed down, once we had a weekend to ourselves, once the house was paid off. The once never came, or rather, the once came and passed multiple times, and each time we arrived at the other side of it, the situation had not changed, and I had quietly updated my expectations again to match the new baseline, and we never spoke about it directly. Not once. Not in 51 years of marriage. I want you to understand that. Not once. I didn't ask because I didn't know how to ask without it sounding like an accusation. Eleanor didn't offer because I think, and I've had years to think about this. She genuinely didn't register the absence the way I did. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't punishment. It was incompatibility that we had agreed wordlessly and completely to never name. I had a brother-in-law named Ray. Ray was married to my sister Carol, and Ray was a different kind of man. Restless, self-aware in a way that men of our generation rarely were. Someone who took his own interior life seriously enough to act on it. In 1991, when he was 58 years old, Ray sat down with Carol and told her he couldn't continue. No affair, no crisis. He just said, I've been disappearing inside this for years, and I can't keep doing it. They separated. The family thought he'd lost his mind. I remember my mother calling it selfish. I remember nodding along when she said it. I was 51 years old. I had 33 more years of marriage ahead of me, and I called Ray selfish for leaving. There was a blue shirt. I know how that sounds, but let me tell you about the blue shirt, because it's the most honest way I know to explain what happened to me over those 51 years. It was a simple thing, cotton, faded, the kind of soft that only comes from being washed 100 times. I'd had it since the mid-'80s. I used to wear it on weekend mornings around the house. And somewhere in the mid-'90s, I couldn't tell you the exact year, which is part of what I'm trying to tell you, I noticed that I had stopped wearing it. It was still in the drawer, in perfect condition. I just didn't reach for it anymore. When I finally thought about why, the answer was so mundane, I almost didn't trust it. I had worn that shirt every time I tried to reach Eleanor, not consciously, not as some kind of ritual. It was just the shirt I happened to be wearing on a Saturday morning when I'd put my hand on her shoulder, or when I'd sat close to her on the couch, or when I'd said something that was an attempt at an opening, a door held slightly ajar, waiting to see if she'd walk through. She never did, not because she was cold, not out of malice. She simply wasn't interested, and she conveyed that with a particular kind of gentle, absolute finality that left no room for argument or negotiation, only for retreat. And I retreated every time. I retreated politely, agreeably, without a scene, the way I'd been trained to believe was the dignified response. And at some point, without deciding to, I had stopped putting on the blue shirt. I had stopped holding the door. I had closed it so quietly that I hadn't even heard the click. That's the domino. That's how it actually works. Not one catastrophic decision, but 10,000 small retreats, each one so reasonable in the moment that you can't point to any individual one and call it wrong. You stop initiating, then you stop expecting, then you stop hoping, which is different from expecting. Then you reclassify the whole area of your life as something that simply doesn't apply to you anymore. The way a man who can't run anymore stops thinking of himself as a runner. And the reclassification feels like acceptance, which feels like maturity, which feels like peace. It isn't peace. I know that now. What it is managed emptiness. By the time our children were grown, our youngest left home in 1996, I had been living in managed emptiness for the better part of a decade. And here is what I lost in that time. And I want to say this as specifically as I can, because the easy answer is sex, and the real answer is everything adjacent to sex that nobody talks about. I lost the sense that my body mattered to another person. Not in a vanity sense. I wasn't a vain man, and I'm certainly not one at 84. I mean something more basic than that. The biological, entirely human experience of being wanted, of having your physical presence mean something to someone, of being touched, not out of obligation or affection in the abstract sense, but because another person specifically wanted to touch you. That experience, over time, had simply ceased to exist in my life. And what that does to a person, what it did to me, was not dramatic. It didn't make me angry or depressed in any clinical way. It just made me quieter, less present, slightly smaller than I'd been before. I became easier to overlook, including by myself. I stopped having opinions at dinner. That's a small thing to say, but I remember noticing it sometime in the early 2000s. Eleanor would say something about the neighbors or about a decision one of the kids had made, and I would have a thought, a real thought with weight and specificity to it, and I would not say it. Not because it wasn't welcome, just because the habit of not saying things had become so total that it had migrated from the bedroom to the table to my entire interior life. I had practiced smallness for so long that I had become small. In 2001, on a Saturday evening in October, I don't know why I remember it was October, but I do, because the game was on television, and I'd turned it off because Eleanor didn't like the noise. We ate dinner together. She was reading a magazine. I had the newspaper folded in my lap, unread. The food went cold. At some point I thought I could say something. Right now, I could say, Eleanor, I need to tell you something. I had the words. I knew what they were. And I sat there with them in my mouth. And I said nothing. And she turned a page. And we were done eating. And she got up and rinsed her plate and went to watch something in the other room. And I sat there alone at the table for another 20 minutes with the newspaper I hadn't opened and the food I'd barely tasted and the words still in my mouth, going stale. That was the moment. Not the hotel room in Cleveland, not the blue shirt. That Saturday in October, when both of us were right there, and I had something real to say, and I chose the newspaper. Now let me tell you about Ray. After his divorce from Carol, Ray spent 2 years being the family scandal. My mother stopped inviting him to things. My brothers didn't return his calls for a while. I saw him occasionally, and there was an awkwardness between us that neither of us fully addressed, because what I felt when I saw Ray, underneath the politely maintained disapproval, was something I didn't want to look at directly. I felt envy, a specific bodily envy, that had nothing to do with his freedom in the abstract, and everything to do with the fact that he was still alive in ways I was no longer alive. He was present in his own skin. He laughed at things the way I used to laugh, before I'd had the volume turned down so slowly I hadn't noticed the quiet. Ray remarried eventually. A woman named Patricia, 10 years younger than him, who was loud and funny, and who clearly, visibly, delighted in him. I met her at a family gathering sometime in the mid-90s. I watched Ray put his hand on the small of her back, casually, without any calculation, the way people do when they are genuinely at ease with another body. It was a nothing gesture. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, and I had to look away. Not because I was jealous of Patricia, because I recognized what I was watching. That ease, the ordinary, unremarkable ease of two people who want to be near each other, was something I had not experienced in so long that seeing it felt like watching a language I used to speak. I was 50-something years old. I had decades ahead of me, and I looked away. I left Eleanor in 2019. I was 79 years old. Our youngest child was 43. The house was paid off. Eleanor's health was fine. Mine was fine. There was no affair, no crisis, no catastrophic event that forced the decision. There was only me, sitting across from her at breakfast one morning. The same breakfast we'd had together for 50 years. Eggs and coffee, the news on the radio, the ordinary domestic machinery of a long marriage running smoothly, and thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, I am going to die having never been fully present in my own life. And that is a choice I am still making. Right now, this morning. I filed for divorce 4 months later. The lawyer was younger than my children. The paperwork took longer than I expected. Eleanor was not destroyed by it. That surprised me. And then it didn't. We had both been managing the same absence for 50 years, just from different positions. She was sad, I think. Relieved, maybe, in ways she couldn't say. My children were not kind about it at first. My eldest told me I was having some kind of breakdown. My daughter didn't return my calls for 3 months. Ray called me the week the papers were signed and said, "Took you long enough." He said it without judgment, just fact. The morning after I signed, I drove to the diner near my apartment. I was renting an apartment at 79, which is its own particular strangeness, and I ordered eggs and coffee because that's what I always ordered. And I sat in the booth alone, and I tried to figure out what I was feeling. Not happiness, not relief exactly, not yet. Something more specific than either of those. After about 40 minutes, I identified it. I was not performing anything. I was not managing anything. I was not editing myself for a room. I was just an old man in a diner with eggs, and nobody in that building expected anything from me. And I could sit there for as long as I wanted. And I was, quietly, in a way I had almost forgotten was possible, entirely myself. I was 79 years old, and that was the first time in decades I'd been able to say that. Here is the brutal truth, not the obvious one, not leave if you're unhappy, which is advice anyone can give and nobody actually needs. The real one. Staying in a sexless marriage is not a sacrifice. I know that's what it feels like. I know that's the story you tell yourself, that you're the stable one, the loyal one, the one holding it together for the family, for the children, for the structure of the thing. I told myself that story for 50 years. It has a certain dignity to it. It lets you feel like the one who endured. What it actually is disappearance. Managed, gradual, polite disappearance. You don't lose yourself in a moment. You lose yourself across decades through a million small decisions to make yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding, less present. And because it happens so slowly, you genuinely don't notice it happening. You just look up one day and realize that the man who used to wear a blue cotton shirt on Saturday mornings because he was the kind of person who reached for people, that man has been gone for 20 years, and you let him go without a fight, and you called it maturity. I think about people I know who are in the middle of this right now, not the ones in crisis, the ones in the ordinary version of what I'm describing, the ones who sleep in the same bed and don't touch, who go through the domestic routines, dinner, television, bed, breakfast, and call it companionship because it looks like companionship from the outside, who have built a life around the absence and furnished it so well that sometimes they forget the absence is there. If that is you, and I'm not asking you to raise your hand, I know what it's like to not want to say yes to that. Then I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it honestly, alone, wherever you are right now. When was the last time you felt wanted, not appreciated, not necessary, not tolerated or accommodated or respected? Wanted, specifically, physically, unmistakably wanted. The way another person can want you when they are genuinely glad you exist in a body. If you can't remember, you don't need me to tell you what that means. You already know. I'm not telling you to leave. Leaving at 79 was not triumphant. It was late and incomplete and full of things I can't undo. Ray had 58. I had 79. The difference between those two numbers is 20 years of Saturday evenings at a table with a newspaper I didn't open. What I am telling you is this: the conversation you've been not having, the real one, the one you've been translating into something smaller and safer every time you get close to it. That conversation is not going to become easier the longer you wait. It only becomes more necessary, more overdue, more expensive. Tonight, before you turn off the light, not a speech, not an ultimatum, just the true sentence, whatever yours is, the one you've been carrying around in your mouth for years, that you keep choosing the newspaper over. Say it. Tell me in the comments, how long have you been not saying yours? Because I didn't say mine for 51 years, and I am 84 years old, and I would give almost anything to have said it sooner.